The moment those trucks rolled into Marsh Farm, something felt off. Not just unusual, disturbingly defiant. Because sitting inside those neatly packed boxes was a message so bold, so unapologetic, it practically screamed rebellion against reality itself. 4 months after King Charles III officially stripped him of everything that once defined him, there it was, stamped in black and white like a ghost that refused to die. His Royal Highness. A title erased by law, but apparently not by the man who lost it. And that's where this story stops being about protocol and starts becoming something far darker. Think about that for a second. A man publicly stripped of rank, respect, and relevance, still clinging to the very identity the world has already buried. Those boxes weren't just belongings, they were evidence. Evidence of denial so deep, so stubborn, it's almost chilling. Because this wasn't a quiet oversight, this was deliberate, calculated, almost like a silent protest against a system that had already moved on without him. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the question echoing through those corridors. Is he refusing to accept reality, or does he genuinely believe it doesn't apply to him? Because behind closed doors, the whispers get louder. Reports didn't just suggest defiance, they painted a pattern. Right after the royal decree, when the ink was still fresh and the consequences still settling, he allegedly continued demanding to be addressed as His Royal Highness. Not once. Not casually, but consistently, as if nothing had changed, as if the monarchy itself had no authority over him. And that's where things start to feel unsettling. Staff, caught in this strange tug of war between official orders and personal insistence, reportedly became confused, almost paralyzed. Imagine standing there, knowing the rules have changed, yet being pressured to pretend they haven't. That tension didn't just linger, it escalated to the point where a formal directive had to be issued. A single word replaced an entire lifetime of privilege. Sir. Just Sir. Simple. Cold, final, and yet even that seemed too much to accept. Because for someone who built his entire identity around hierarchy, status wasn't just important, it was everything. The bowing, the titles, the invisible ladder that placed him above others, it wasn't just tradition, it was oxygen. And suddenly, that oxygen was cut off. But here's where it turns almost unbearable. The same system that once elevated him now demands something unthinkable. He must bow to his own daughters. Let that sink in. A father, once towering in rank, now required to lower himself in front of his children because they outrank him. That's not just protocol, that's humiliation written into tradition. And insiders aren't whispering about acceptance, they're predicting resistance. Because how do you reconcile a lifetime of entitlement with a reality that strips it away overnight? You don't. You fight it. You deny it. You pretend it never happened. And maybe, just maybe, you start believing your own version of the truth. But this didn't begin recently. No, the cracks were always there. Stories from inside the palace, quiet at first, almost dismissed, now feel like warning signs everyone ignored. Accounts describing dismissive behavior, sharp words, an air of superiority so thick it made people uncomfortable. Not loud chaos, but controlled arrogance. The kind that doesn't shout, it assumes obedience, assumes respect, assumes superiority. And over time, those assumptions hardened into something else, something colder. Staff reportedly walking on eggshells, small mistakes turning into reasons for reassignment. Not major failures, tiny details, a scent, a tone, a presence that didn't align with expectations. It wasn't just authority, it was control. Control rooted in the belief that status placed him beyond accountability. So when everything began collapsing, the titles, the privileges, the protection, something inside didn't shift. It resisted, almost violently. And then came the moment that shattered whatever illusion remained. Early morning. No warning, no preparation, just reality arriving at the door, uninvited and undeniable. What followed wasn't panic, it was disbelief. Not fear, but offense. As if the situation itself was beneath him. That reaction says everything. Because when consequences finally arrived, they weren't met with reflection, they were met with outrage. A silent, burning question hanging in the air. Do you know who I am? But that's the problem. The world does know. And that's exactly why everything changed. Even after that, even after the public humiliation, the loss, the scrutiny, the demands didn't stop. Bigger house, full staff, continued funding, as if the system that had already turned its back would suddenly reverse course. But reality had other plans. What he envisioned and what he received couldn't be further apart. A shrinking world, fewer privileges, empty roles, silence where authority once echoed. And And then, the unthinkable. The people who once served without question began refusing, not quietly stepping back, but actively declining. A silent rebellion, a refusal to participate in a reality they no longer believed in. That's not just rejection, that's collapse. Because when the system itself begins to reject you, what's left? And yet those boxes still arrive, still marked, still carrying a title that no longer exists. Like a man frozen in time, watching the world move on without him, but refusing to take a single step forward. So the question lingers, heavier than ever. Is this denial or is it something deeper? Because if reality is no longer being accepted, then what happens next? And here's where it stops being just a story about one man and starts looking like a slow-motion collapse that nobody inside the system can fully control anymore. Because what we're seeing isn't just resistance, it's persistence. A refusal to shrink, even when everything around him is closing in. The world has redrawn the lines, erased the titles, rewritten the rules, but inside his world, none of that seems to register. And that disconnect, that's where the real tension lives. Because even after the arrest, after the headlines, after the quiet but unmistakable distancing from the royal inner circle, the expectations didn't fade, they escalated. Requests for a 6 to 7 bedroom estate, full staffing, security, long-term financial guarantees, not as a negotiation, but almost like an assumption, as if the fall from grace was temporary, as if this was all just a phase that would eventually correct itself. But the response he got wasn't negotiation, it was limitation, smaller space, fewer resources, bare minimum support, a reality that looked nothing like the one he still seemed to be operating in. And that contrast, it's brutal. Because it exposes something deeper than entitlement, it exposes a belief system that hasn't caught up with reality, a belief that rank is permanent, that identity is untouchable, that what you were is what you still are, no matter what anyone says. But reality doesn't work like that. And when reality and belief collide, something has to break. But what if nothing breaks? What if instead of adapting, the illusion just tightens its grip? Because the signs are everywhere. The boxes marked French weren't a mistake, they were a message. The insistence on being addressed by a stripped title wasn't confusion, it was defiance. The demands for status-level living after losing that status, it all points to one thing. A man not transitioning out of power, but clinging to it as if it never left. And that kind of psychological standstill doesn't just affect him, it ripples outward. Look at the people around him. Staff who once followed orders without question, now refusing entirely. Not hesitating, not negotiating, just walking away. That's not just dissatisfaction, that's a complete breakdown of authority. Because authority only works when people believe in it. And the moment they stop believing, it disappears. Completely. And then there's the public. The numbers don't whisper, they shout. Overwhelming disapproval. A reputation that hasn't just dipped, it's collapsed. And yet, there's no visible shift, no public reckoning, no quiet retreat, just the same posture, the same expectations, the same insistence that nothing has fundamentally changed. But everything has. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of this entire situation. Because usually, when someone falls from that kind of height, there's a moment, a pause, a realization, a visible adjustment, something that signals awareness. But here, that moment feels missing, replaced by something else, something quieter but more stubborn, a refusal to acknowledge the fall at all. And the royal family, they're watching this unfold in real time, carefully, cautiously. Because this isn't just personal anymore, it's structural. It raises questions nobody wants to ask out loud. How does a system built on hierarchy deal with someone who refuses to accept their place within it? What happens when the rules are enforced but not believed? When consequences are delivered but not internalized? Because enforcement without acceptance creates tension, and tension, left unresolved, turns into something unpredictable. You can almost feel that unpredictability building, not explosive, but steady, quiet, like pressure accumulating behind a sealed door. The palace maintains distance, statements remain measured, everything appears controlled on the surface. But underneath, there's movement, there's adjustment, there's a system trying to recalibrate around someone who refuses to recalibrate himself. And that's where the story takes its most uncomfortable turn. Because this isn't just about a man losing titles. It's about what happens when identity is so deeply tied to status that removing that status doesn't remove the identity. It lingers. It fights back. It reshapes reality to fit itself. And suddenly, you're not dealing with someone adapting to change, you're dealing with someone resisting it entirely. And resistance like that doesn't just fade away. It escalates, or it isolates. And right now, it's doing both. The isolation is visible. Fewer appearances, reduced presence, a shrinking circle. But the escalation? That's in the details. The continued demands, the refusal to adjust language, the subtle but consistent pushback against a system that has already made its decision. So what happens next? Because this isn't a situation that neatly resolves itself. There's no clear ending here, no final statement that wraps everything up and restores balance. Instead, there's this lingering tension, this unresolved contradiction between what is and what is still being claimed. A man officially stripped of everything, still acting as if nothing was taken. A system that has moved on, still being quietly challenged, and somewhere in between, a reality that feels increasingly unstable. Because the longer this disconnect continues, the more it raises a question nobody can comfortably answer. What happens when someone refuses to accept the world they're living in and continues operating in one that no longer exists? Does the world eventually force alignment? Or does the illusion find a way to survive? Because those boxes still marked hurt. They weren't just belongings, they were a statement. And statements like that don't just disappear.